The wars, kings, and Stark dynasties that could reshape Westeros. Game of Thrones ended with something that almost never lasts in Westeros: peace. Daenerys Targaryen was dead. The Iron Throne was molten metal. The Night King had been destroyed. The North was independent, and Bran Stark had been elected ruler of the remaining 6 kingdoms. But the finale was an ending to the characters' immediate wars, not necessarily to Westerosi history. Bran had no conventional dynasty. Sansa had created a separate northern crown. Jon Snow, arguably the most politically dangerous man alive, disappeared beyond the wall. Arya sailed into territory literally missing from Westerosi maps. And somewhere across the narrow sea, the last living dragon vanished carrying Daenerys Targaryen's body. 20 years later, Westeros would almost certainly look very different. This is not hidden canon. No official story currently tells us what happens 2 decades after the finale. Even the proposed Jon Snow continuation failed to find a story its creators considered strong enough to pursue, although Kit Harington has continued to leave open the possibility of returning if the right idea emerged. What follows is therefore a probability exercise. Take the personalities, institutions, and unresolved conflicts left in the television series. Add the political realities Game of Thrones spent 8 seasons establishing, and ask what is most likely to happen next. The answer is considerably less peaceful than the final montage suggested. Jon Snow becomes the most powerful man who refuses to be king. Jon's final scene is deceptively important. He has been formally sent back to the Night's Watch as punishment for killing Daenerys. But instead of ending his story standing on the wall, he rides through its gates and heads north with Tormund, Ghost, and the Free Folk. The widespread interpretation is that Jon is effectively abandoning Southern politics and returning to the only society in which his birth has never mattered very much. Fan discussion since the finale has repeatedly converged on some version of Jon becoming a leader among the Free Folk, even if nobody formally crowns him. That fits Jon far better than a return to King's Landing. 20 years later, Jon would be approaching 50. He would almost certainly be scarred, quieter, and less interested than ever in titles. But that does not mean he would be irrelevant. The Free Folk follow strength, loyalty, and deeds, rather than conventional inheritance. Jon united wildlings with the Night's Watch, fought the dead, survived his own murder, rode a dragon, commanded armies, and helped destroy both the Night King and Daenerys. He would become legendary whether he wanted to or not. The phrase, "king beyond the wall," is probably technically wrong. Jon has spent his life discovering what happens when people become obsessed with crowns, and his final act against Daenerys effectively rejects absolute power itself. But functionally, he probably becomes something close to it. Communities would begin rebuilding places such as Hardhome. Former wildling clans would settle increasingly permanent villages. The disappearance of the White Walkers removes the existential force that had driven the Free Folk south, while the final shot's emerging vegetation strongly suggests life north of the wall is continuing, rather than simply dying. Jon would gradually become the mediator between these communities. He would settle feuds, organize defense, coordinate hunting and agriculture, and become the person people seek when disputes threaten violence. Jon Snow spends 8 seasons repeatedly insisting that he does not want authority, and repeatedly receiving it anyway. There is little reason to think that pattern suddenly stops. Does Jon ever return to Winterfell? Almost certainly. The idea that Jon never again sees Sansa, Bran, or Arya for the rest of his life is much harder to believe than the finale's emotional separation makes it appear. His punishment mattered primarily because Grey Worm and Daenerys' surviving forces demanded justice. Once the Unsullied leave Westeros, the practical mechanism enforcing Jon's exile largely disappears. Sansa is queen in the north. She controls the territory directly south of the wall. If she wants Jon permitted through Castle Black, nobody in Westeros is realistically going to stop her. Jon probably does not return quickly. Daenerys' death would remain an enormous psychological wound, and Harington himself later described the potential appeal of a sequel as exploring the soldier after the war, rather than simply placing Jon into another political adventure. Within 5 or 10 years, however, the barriers become ceremonial. By year 20, Jon probably visits Winterfell periodically while continuing to live north of the wall. He may even have a family. That would be the final irony of Jon Snow's story. The supposed bastard who discovered he was actually Aegon Targaryen might deliberately allow the Targaryen royal line to disappear by refusing to use the name. Jon's children, if he has them, would probably grow up as neither princes nor claimants. They would simply be Jon's children, and that is probably exactly how he would want it. Sansa Stark builds the strongest realm in Westeros. Of all the characters at the end of Game of Thrones, Sansa arguably begins the next era in the strongest position. She has exactly what virtually every ruler spent the series trying to obtain: legitimacy, a loyal population, defensible territory, and no immediate rival claimant. She's crowned queen in the north, with the northern lords enthusiastically acknowledging Stark rule. Bran accepts independence. Jon leaves. Arya does not want political authority. For the first decade, Sansa's reign is therefore likely to be surprisingly stable. Her priorities would be brutally practical. Winterfell and northern settlements have suffered years of warfare. Food reserves were depleted. Major houses were destroyed or severely weakened. The population lost thousands during battles against the Boltons and the dead. Sansa's first great achievement would not be conquering anybody. It would be rebuilding. Roads would be restored. Abandoned farms resettled. Winterfell repaired. Trade with White Harbor expanded. Castle defenses rebuilt. Surviving houses rewarded for loyalty. Sansa has also experienced enough southern politics to understand something earlier Starks repeatedly underestimated. Military courage does not replace intelligence. Ned went south and died. Robb won battles and lost his kingdom. Jon repeatedly underestimated political enemies. Sansa learns from all three. 20 years later, she would probably be one of the longest-serving rulers in Westeros. Sansa's biggest problem is succession. This is where her happy ending becomes politically complicated. The independent North needs a successor. Sansa cannot simply rule indefinitely, and then allow the question to resolve itself. She therefore probably marries. Not because the romantic Sansa Stark of Season 1 still dreams of a handsome prince, but because Queen Sansa understands dynastic mathematics. Her husband would probably be a northern noble, or someone whose political position is weak enough that he cannot dominate her crown. She would be exceptionally cautious about marrying into another enormously powerful house after everything she endured with the Lannisters, Boltons, and Littlefinger. Her children would almost certainly carry the Stark name. That matters enormously. Within 20 years, the Stark monarchy could already be becoming institutionalized. Instead of an independent North being a temporary consequence of Daenerys' fall, Sansa could turn it into a hereditary kingdom capable of surviving her. And unlike Bran's new political experiment, Sansa's succession mechanism is extremely easy to understand. Her eldest suitable child inherits. Ironically, that simplicity could make the supposedly old-fashioned North considerably more stable than the politically innovative Six Kingdoms. Bran's reign is peaceful, until the question everyone avoided returns. Bran is the hardest character to predict, because Bran is no longer operating like a conventional human ruler. He possesses access to extraordinary knowledge of Westeros's past, and at least limited glimpses of possible futures. Isaac Hempstead Wright has specifically argued that Bran does not simply possess perfect knowledge of everything that will happen. His knowledge of history is vast, while the future remains considerably less clear. That distinction matters. Bran is not a cheat code who prevents every rebellion before it starts. But he may be the most difficult king in Westerosi history to deceive. Littlefinger could probably never survive in Bran's court. Secret conspiracies become vastly more dangerous when your king can potentially discover what occurred by accessing the past. That creates a strange political equilibrium. For perhaps the first 10 or 15 years, Bran could preside over one of the quietest periods Westeros has experienced in generations. He has no obvious personal ambitions. He does not appear motivated by wealth, sex, dynasty, or glory. He is unlikely to launch wars because somebody insulted him. Tyrion handles ordinary government, while Bran effectively becomes the kingdom's strategic intelligence system. Even Hempstead Wright joked after the finale about the unsettling implication that Westeros could effectively become a surveillance state, under a ruler capable of seeing events others believe to be private. The question is what happens when Bran dies. That is the unexploded bomb underneath the finale. The Great Council establishes that future rulers are supposedly to be chosen, rather than automatically inherited. But Westeros has almost no institutional framework for peaceful elective monarchy. Who votes? Every lord? Only the great houses? Can candidates campaign? Can armies intimidate electors? What happens when two houses claim the result was manipulated? What stops the wealthiest lord simply purchasing enough support? The first election was easy because the kingdom was exhausted and practically everybody wanted the wars to stop. The second election could be completely different. The Six Kingdoms probably survive Bran, but barely. 20 years is roughly the point at which Westeros's new constitutional arrangement starts becoming genuinely dangerous. Bran may still be alive. The show never clearly establishes what lifespan being the three-eyed raven gives him. So predictions that he could reign for centuries go far beyond what television canon establishes. If he does remain king after 20 years, the Six Kingdoms are probably intact. If he dies earlier, the probability of political crisis rises dramatically. The greatest long-term weakness is obvious. Sansa demonstrated that leaving the kingdom is possible. Why should Dorne remain? Why should the Iron Islands? Yara Greyjoy had previously demanded independence from Daenerys. Dorne had been effectively semi-independent for much of Westerosi history. Once the North successfully leaves without being invaded, every separatist faction gains a precedent. Bran's personal connection to Sansa allows the arrangement to work. His successor may not feel the same way. The most plausible future is therefore not an immediate collapse into 6 separate countries. Economic ties, marriage alliances, shared defense, and centuries of political integration make total disintegration expensive. Instead, Westeros probably becomes increasingly decentralized. The Iron Islands obtain more autonomy. Dorne demands guarantees. The Reach becomes economically powerful again. The Vale remains largely self-governing. The Riverlands rely increasingly on alliances with both the North and Crown. The ruler in King's Landing remains king, but the monarchy becomes weaker. In effect, Bran may accidentally begin Westeros's transition away from absolute monarchy. That could ultimately be his greatest legacy. Not creating a perfect king, making the king matter less. Tyrion Lannister spends the rest of his life rebuilding what his family destroyed. Tyrion's ending is not freedom, it is a sentence. Bran appoints him hand partly because Tyrion is capable, and partly because Tyrion has made catastrophic mistakes. He must spend the rest of his career repairing Westeros. 20 years later, Tyrion would probably be remembered as one of the most important hands in history. King's Landing alone presents an enormous task. Large areas were destroyed during Daenerys' assault. Administration needs restoring. Trade has to resume. Refugees need homes. Crown finances have been shattered by years of war. Tyrion's strength has always been institutional politics. His greatest weakness was judging rulers. With Bran, that problem changes. Tyrion is no longer trying to moderate Joffrey or prevent Daenerys becoming increasingly ruthless. He has a king who barely appears motivated by conventional human ego. That gives Tyrion room to govern. He would probably create something resembling a professional central administration, better tax collection, reconstructed ports, restored sanitation, grain planning, and tighter oversight of the crown's finances. Bronn as master of coin initially looks absurd, but even that arrangement can work if Tyrion surrounds him with competent officials. Tyrion's more important long-term contribution may be constitutional. He understands better than most people alive how dynastic succession destroyed Westeros. Expect him to formalize the Great Council system before Bran's death. Written procedures, recognized electors, rules governing candidates, perhaps even limits on royal authority. It would still be medieval Westeros, not democracy. But Tyrion could spend his final decades quietly constructing institutions strong enough to survive bad kings. That might finally redeem the Lannister legacy. Arya Stark probably never returns to live in Westeros. Arya's ending is the most geographically open. She sails west of Westeros into largely unknown waters. That is exceptionally dangerous. Westerosi history already contains stories of sailors attempting similar voyages, most famously Brandon the Shipwright, who disappeared at sea centuries earlier. Arya could therefore simply die. But narratively, that is probably not the most likely interpretation of her final scene. The entire sequence presents her departure as liberation, rather than doom. Fan speculation has consequently imagined everything from previously unknown islands to voyages eventually connecting Arya with distant parts of Essos. The most plausible outcome is that Arya becomes Westeros's great explorer. She loses ships. She encounters unfamiliar peoples. She spends years away. And eventually she returns with information that changes Westerosi maps. She might discover islands rather than an entirely unknown continent. She could theoretically circumnavigate the known world and reach eastern Essos, although the geography remains too uncertain to make that anything more than speculation. 20 years later, Arya may resemble an almost mythical maritime figure. Not Lady Arya, not Queen Arya. Captain Arya Stark. She might have ships operating between Westeros and whatever lands she discovers, bringing exotic goods, maps, and stories back to Old Town and White Harbor. Would she see her family again? Almost certainly, assuming she survives. Arya's rejection of conventional Westerosi life does not mean she stops loving the Starks. She would visit. She just probably never stays. Drogon is the most dangerous unresolved question in the world. Drogon changes everything, because dragons do not simply vanish from history. The finale establishes that he takes Daenerys' body and flies east. During Bran's first small council meeting, Sam begins reporting that Drogon was last seen heading east before the conversation is interrupted. Bran then says he might try to find him. The Volantis theory, therefore, has some basis in the direction given by the episode. So does the possibility of Old Valyria. But the much more dramatic theory that Drogon takes Daenerys to followers of the Lord of Light who resurrect her is considerably less likely. Resurrection exists in Game of Thrones. That part is unquestionable. Beric Dondarrion returns repeatedly. Jon returns. The Red Priestess Kinvara had also proclaimed Daenerys central to a divine purpose earlier in the series. That combination created the persistent fan theory that Drogon could transport Daenerys east to people capable of restoring her to life. Possible? Within this universe, technically, yes. Most likely? No. Daenerys' death is presented as final. Reversing it would dramatically undermine Jon's choice and the entire ending. The more probable future is stranger. Drogon becomes wild. For years there are reports. A black shape above ruined Valyria. Burned livestock near Essosi settlements. Sailors claiming they saw an enormous dragon crossing the smoking sea. Most accounts would probably be false. Some would not. And Drogon would continue growing. 20 years later he could be vastly larger than he was during Daenerys' conquest. That makes him essentially a living strategic weapon without an owner. If somebody ever manages to bond with him, Westerosi politics changes overnight. Which raises a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Jon Snow is the last confirmed living Targaryen. If Drogon ever returns to Westeros, the person with the strongest plausible connection to him may be the man who killed Daenerys. Brienne becomes one of the most respected knights in Westerosi history. Brienne's future is probably less dramatic but more secure. She ends the series as Lord Commander of Bran's Kingsguard. That gives her something she spent her entire life being told she could never fully possess. Formal recognition as one of Westeros's greatest knights. 20 years of service would transform her reputation. Young knights who once mocked the idea of women fighting would grow up hearing stories of Sir Brienne of Tarth defending Sansa Stark, fighting the dead, and serving as Lord Commander. She could inadvertently change Westerosi culture. Not overnight. But precedent matters. Once Brienne has commanded the Kingsguard successfully for decades, excluding another talented woman simply because of her sex becomes more difficult to justify. Eventually, she probably retires to Tarth, particularly if her father dies and succession requires her attention. But her entry in the White Book would be enormous, and Jaime's would no longer be the only complicated legacy preserved there. Podrick Payne becomes the knight nobody expected. Podrick's ending beside Brienne is one of the quietest transformations in the finale. He begins the series as an awkward squire. He ends it as Sir Podrick Payne of the Kingsguard. 20 years later, he is probably a veteran knight, and potentially Brienne's successor as Lord Commander. He has been trained by Tyrion's circle, Brienne, and years of warfare. More importantly, Podrick possesses something astonishingly rare among powerful Westerosi men. He is fundamentally decent. That could make him exactly the kind of figure Bran's new political order needs. If Brienne becomes the legendary first great commander of the post-war Kingsguard, Podrick may be the person who institutionalizes her reforms after she leaves. Samwell Tarly changes Westeros more than almost anyone. Sam's long-term influence could be enormous. He becomes Grand Maester despite his highly unconventional route through the Citadel. He has seen White Walkers. He helped discover how they could be killed. He knows Jon's true parentage. He survived the Night's Watch, the Long Night, and Daenerys' conquest. Most importantly, Sam is intellectually curious in a society dominated by hereditary power. His proposal that ordinary people should choose rulers is laughed out of the dragon pit. But ideas do not disappear merely because aristocrats laugh at them. 20 years of working beside an elected king could push Sam toward recording and defending increasingly radical political ideas. Universal democracy is generations away, if it ever comes. But councils of nobles could expand. Cities could demand representation. Guilds could gain formal voices. Old Town scholars might begin discussing whether legitimacy comes exclusively from birth. Sam could therefore become the intellectual grandfather of a much more representative Westeros. He would probably also write extensively about the Long Night. Future generations might initially regard parts of the story as exaggeration. A dead army, an ice king, dragons, a resurrected commander. The events are so extraordinary that within a century skeptical maesters could be arguing about whether the accounts were literal. Sam would make sure the evidence survived. Gilly creates the stable family Sam never had. Gilly's future is comparatively peaceful, and she deserves it. She and Sam would probably establish a household either connected to King's Landing or eventually Horn Hill. Sam's status creates an unresolved technical problem because maesters are traditionally forbidden from maintaining families and inheriting lands. The finale largely ignores that contradiction. 20 years later, the simplest solution is that Bran's post-war government has quietly rewritten several rules. House Tarly also needs continuity after Randall and Dickon die. Sam may remain primarily a scholar and advisor, while his children eventually inherit the family's lands. Gilly, meanwhile, goes from Craster's brutal household to becoming part of one of the Reach's major families. That may be one of the most complete social reversals in the entire series. Davos Seaworth becomes the conscience of the new government. Davos is already older by the finale. He probably does not remain master of ships for another 20 years. But he could spend the first decade of Bran's reign doing something desperately needed, making the new government function. Davos understands ordinary people, in a way almost nobody at court does. He was not born into nobility. He knows smuggling, shipping, hunger, war, commerce, and the cost of rulers' ambitions. Eventually, he retires. Unlike many Game of Thrones characters, Davos's ideal ending is neither throne nor battlefield. It is home. He returns to his surviving family, perhaps spending his final years as a respected elder statesman occasionally summoned when the crown needs somebody who will tell it what nobody else wants to say. Bronn becomes incredibly rich and surprisingly effective. Giving Highgarden to Bronn remains one of the finale's most chaotic decisions, but Bronn possesses exactly the qualities required to survive the next era. He is practical. He understands incentives. He likes money. He has almost no interest in ideology. 20 years later, Bronn could be obscenely wealthy. The Reach is Westeros' agricultural heartland. Highgarden controls fertile territory, capable of generating enormous income once peace returns. Bronn's initial administration would probably be crude, but he is not stupid. He hires capable stewards because capable stewards make him richer. He invests in roads because roads improve trade. He protects farmers because dead farmers produce no taxes. Accidentally, selfishness begins resembling competent government. His children, however, create another problem. A new house ruling the Reach will face aristocratic resentment from families who believe their lineage is vastly superior. Bronn may spend his later years ensuring nobody can remove his descendants after he is gone. Gendry establishes a new Baratheon dynasty. Gendry's elevation to Lord of Storm's End gives Westeros something extremely important: continuity. House Baratheon effectively returns from extinction. 20 years later, Gendry would probably be married with children and deeply embedded in Stormland's politics. His illegitimate birth initially matters. After 2 decades, much less. Victory creates legitimacy quickly in Westeros. Gendry also carries an extraordinary symbolic story. Robert Baratheon's bastard son survives the wars, is legitimized by Daenerys, then remains lord after her death. His children become legitimate Baratheons. Within a generation, the awkward blacksmith from Fleabottom could be remembered as the founder of the second Baratheon line. Arya probably does not become his wife. Their paths have diverged too completely. But it is easy to imagine their friendship surviving. Yara Greyjoy eventually forces another independence crisis. Yara is one of the characters most likely to cause Bran trouble. She accepted the final settlement, but the Iron Islands had already sought independence. If the North gets sovereignty, the Ironborn have an obvious argument. Why not us? Bran can probably contain that dispute through autonomy rather than force. The Iron Islands might retain nominal membership of the Six Kingdoms, while gaining almost complete control over internal affairs. But when Bran eventually dies, Yara or her successor could simply declare independence. Would King's Landing invade? Probably not. A devastated Westeros has little appetite for another expensive campaign against islands that are notoriously difficult to conquer permanently. The precedent set by Sansa continues spreading. Grey Worm probably never returns to Westeros. Grey Worm sails for Neath after Daenerys' death. His entire life has been war, slavery, liberation, and service. Without Daenerys, or Missandei, there is almost nothing emotionally tying him to Westeros. If he survives the journey and whatever challenges life on Neath brings, he probably attempts to honor Missandei by protecting her people. The Unsullied may gradually disappear as a military institution. They cannot reproduce naturally because they were mutilated as children. Without continued slave masters manufacturing new Unsullied, and with Grey Worm violently opposed to the practice, the army has no generational future. 20 years later, surviving Unsullied would be aging veterans. Within another generation, they could be gone entirely. Their final legacy would not be conquest. It would be ending the system that created them. Tormund becomes Jon's closest friend and most important ally. Tormund's future is almost certainly tied to Jon's. He becomes the cultural bridge between Jon and the Free Folk. Where Jon brings strategy and experience dealing with southern kingdoms, Tormund possesses legitimacy within Free Folk culture. The pair would be extremely effective together. Tormund is also one of the few surviving people who genuinely appears to want nothing from Jon except friendship. After years of betrayals, dynastic revelations, and political manipulation, that may be precisely why Jon stays north. 20 years later, if Tormund survives, the two probably resemble aging war chiefs who have spent decades turning a refugee population into permanent communities. No throne, no court, no small council. Probably plenty of arguments. Jon might finally be happy. Ghost gets the ending he deserved. Ghost's future is simpler. He remains with Jon. Direwolves appear deeply linked to Stark identity throughout the series, and Jon abandoning Ghost permanently would run against the emotional meaning of their reunion. Ghost probably lives out the remainder of his life north of the Wall beside Jon. 20 years later, he would almost certainly be dead simply because of age, unless direwolves have dramatically longer lifespans than ordinary wolves. But his descendants are another matter. If Ghost encounters other direwolves in the far north, the species could begin expanding again. That creates an unexpectedly fitting image of Jon's future. No dragons. No throne. Just the descendants of the Stark direwolf roaming freely through lands where kings no longer matter. Robin Arryn becomes one of Westeros's most powerful lords. Robin Arryn is easy to overlook, because the sickly child introduced earlier in the series is transformed considerably by the finale. He controls the Vale. The Vale suffered comparatively less devastation than many other regions, and possesses enormous natural defenses. 20 years of peace could make House Arryn extremely wealthy. Robin therefore has the potential to become one of Bran's most consequential political allies, or one of the decisive electors choosing Bran's eventual successor. His personal development is impossible to predict confidently, but structurally the Vale becomes a major power precisely because so many competing houses were destroyed elsewhere. Edmure Tully probably has the last laugh. Edmure's humiliation at the Great Council overshadows something important. He still controls the Riverlands. And the Riverlands desperately need reconstruction after being devastated repeatedly throughout the wars. If Edmure governs competently for 2 decades, his reputation improves. He also belongs to the extended Stark family network. Sansa rules the North. Bran rules the Six Kingdoms. Robin Arryn is his nephew through Lisa. The Riverlands, therefore, sit at the center of an unusually powerful web of family alliances. 20 years after being told to sit down by Sansa, Edmure might be one of the senior elder statesmen of Westeros. Game of Thrones would probably appreciate the irony. Mira Reed withdraws from great politics. Mira Reed arguably has more reason than almost anyone to want nothing further to do with Bran. She loses her brother Jojen helping Bran reach the Three-Eyed Raven, and eventually leaves after Bran becomes emotionally distant. The most plausible future is therefore quiet. She returns to Greywater Watch. Howland Reed's eventual death could make her head of House Reed. The neck remains strategically important, because virtually every land route between the independent North and the Southern Kingdoms passes through it. That means Mira could become a subtle diplomatic intermediary between Sansa and Bran without returning permanently to court. She knows both of them. She also knows more than almost anyone about what Bran actually became. A new war is almost inevitable. Game of Thrones does not end warfare. It resets the board. The first decade is probably relatively peaceful because every surviving faction is exhausted. The second decade is more dangerous. A new generation reaches adulthood, with no personal memory of the horrors that destroyed their parents. Old ambitions return. The likeliest major conflict is not another supernatural apocalypse. It is a succession war. Bran dies or becomes unable to rule. The great houses assemble to choose a replacement. Several candidates emerge. One loses narrowly and rejects the vote. Armies mobilize. Suddenly Westeros discovers that an elective monarchy can create just as much bloodshed as hereditary monarchy. The North then faces a decision. Does Sansa intervene to stabilize the South? Does she remain neutral? What happens if one Southern claimant argues that Northern independence was illegal, that could produce the first major post-finale war? A second potential conflict involves Dorne, or the Iron Islands attempting to leave the Six Kingdoms. A third involves the Reach, where resentment against Bran's elevation could eventually trigger rebellion. None needs to become another war of the Five Kings. But expecting 20 uninterrupted years of peace would contradict almost everything Game of Thrones tells us about power. The White Walkers probably do not return. The easiest sequel would be to reveal that the Night King somehow survived. It is also one of the least satisfying possibilities. Arya's killing of the Night King destroys the army of the dead. Bringing precisely the same threat back would weaken the significance of the Long Night. There could still be supernatural dangers in the far north. The children of the forest may not be completely gone. Ancient magic certainly still exists. Bran remains supernatural. Drogon remains alive. The Faceless Men remain active. Ashai remains mysterious. So magic has not vanished. But the most likely future threat is something different, rather than Night King 2. Jon might discover ancient ruins, forgotten peoples, or evidence explaining much more about the origin of the White Walkers. That could become his final great adventure, without simply repeating the previous war. Westeros 20 years later. By approximately 20 years after Daenerys' death, the political map could look something like this. The independent kingdom of the North is stable under Queen Sansa Stark, with an emerging Stark succession secured through her children. Beyond the Wall, Jon Snow has become the unofficial leader of a growing free folk civilization, without ever formally declaring himself king. King's Landing has been largely rebuilt under Tyrion's administration. Bran either remains king of the Six Kingdoms, or his approaching succession has become the defining political crisis of the era. The Reach is wealthy under Bran's dynasty. Gendry has restored House Baratheon. House Arryn controls a prosperous Vale. House Tully survives in the Riverlands. Yara's Iron Islands are increasingly autonomous. Dorne pushes constantly against central authority. Old Town flourishes again. Sam becomes one of the era's most influential scholars. Brienne is remembered as a legendary Lord Commander. Arya is either dead at sea or famous across the known world. And somewhere in Essos, rumors continue about a gigantic black dragon. That last detail matters, because almost every major source of magical power at the end of Game of Thrones is either disappearing or becoming isolated. The White Walkers are gone. Daenerys is dead. The other dragons are dead. Melisandre is dead. The children of the forest appear effectively destroyed. Jon wants nothing to do with his Targaryen identity. Bran is the great exception, and Drogon is the other. What happens when Bran finally dies? This would be the defining event of the post-Game of Thrones era. Bran's death would immediately test whether Tyrion's great political experiment was real, or whether peace existed only because one extraordinary individual occupied the throne. The Lords gather. The candidates arrive. Promises are made. Gold changes hands. Marriages are proposed. Old rivalries return. The political genius of the finale is that the Iron Throne was destroyed, but the desire for power was not. A chair was never the real problem. People were. Bran's electoral monarchy creates an opportunity for Westeros to escape endless hereditary war, but it also creates an entirely new form of competition. Sansa's North might actually prove more stable precisely because there is no ambiguity about who inherits. That creates a strange historical reversal. The independent kingdom that rejects King's Landing could become the most conventional monarchy in Westeros. The southern kingdoms that remain united could gradually become something more constitutional. Neither system is guaranteed to survive. And then there is Drogon. Imagine Bran's succession council collapsing into hostility. Two rival coalitions form. The North mobilizes near the neck. The Ironborn declare independence. King's Landing prepares for another war. Then reports arrive from the east. Drogon has been seen again. Not the dragon Westeros remembers. A creature 20 additional years older. Larger. More powerful. And moving west. Who controls him would become the most important question in the world. Perhaps nobody does. Perhaps Bran can locate him but never command him. Perhaps Drogon simply returns to Dragonstone, drawn back to the place where Daenerys was born. Or perhaps he travels further north, toward the last living Targaryen. Jon Snow spent his life rejecting crowns. Westeros spent centuries trying to place Targaryens on them. There would be something perfectly Game of Thrones about the world's most powerful dragon eventually finding the one Targaryen who wants absolutely nothing from him. Jon would still refuse the throne. That is the crucial point. 20 years would not suddenly transform Jon into somebody who desires political supremacy. If anything, watching Sansa govern, Bran's system struggle, and another generation begin repeating the mistakes of the past would reinforce the lesson he learned from Daenerys. Power always asks for one more sacrifice. Jon has already sacrificed enough. The Stark victory becomes permanent. The real winner of Game of Thrones was never Bran alone. It was House Stark 20 years later that victory becomes unmistakable. Sansa establishes an independent northern dynasty. Bran reshapes southern government. Arya carries the Stark name beyond the known world. Jon creates a new society beyond the Wall, while refusing both the Stark and Targaryen crowns available to him. Their parents lose almost everything. Their generation inherits almost everything. But unlike the Lannisters or Targaryens, the Starks do not end the story concentrated around a single throne. They spread out. That is why they survive. Robert Baratheon builds his victory around becoming king. Cersei builds hers around controlling her children. Daenerys builds hers around one supreme ruler. Tywin builds his around the Lannister dynasty. All collapse. The Starks ultimately do the opposite. They separate. North, south, west, beyond the Wall. That may be the most important clue to what happens over the next 20 years. The most likely ending 20 years later. Jon is alive beyond the Wall, older and finally at peace, surrounded by free folk who treat him as a leader even though he refuses a crown. Sansa is still queen in the north or preparing one of her children to succeed her. Arya has become the greatest explorer Westeros has produced in generations, assuming the sea has not claimed her. Tyrion is old, exhausted, and probably still working. Brienne's name has entered legend. Podrick stands among the most respected knights in the realm. Sam has recorded the truth about the Long Night so thoroughly that even future skeptics cannot entirely erase it. Davos has retired. Gendry has children carrying the Baratheon name. Bronn has somehow become one of the richest men in Westeros. Yara has either secured enormous autonomy or finally broken the Iron Islands away. Grey Worm has disappeared into history far across the narrow sea. Tormund is still telling stories that become less believable every year. Bran's reign is remembered as an extraordinary period of reconstruction. But the political system created around him is approaching its ultimate test. And Drogon remains out there. That is why the Six Kingdoms probably survive the next 20 years, but are far less certain to survive the next 100. The finale destroys the Iron Throne, but does not eliminate ambition, nationalism, family rivalry, or the attraction of absolute power. Those forces eventually return because Westeros is still Westeros. The next great war probably does not begin with an army of dead men emerging from the snow. It begins in a council chamber. A king dies. Several nobles stand. Someone loses a vote. Someone refuses to accept it. Ravens fly. Armies begin moving. And far away, perhaps beyond the ruins of Valyria, something enormous spreads black wings across the sky. The Game of Thrones ended. The game itself almost certainly did not.